Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly.
And I'm Anna.
And this is episode 8 of The Graded Escape, which we have titled Homeschooling a Child with an IEP or Special Education Needs. So today our conversation is one that a lot of you have been asking for, or that we've seen questions about through social media: homeschooling a child with an IEP or special education needs. So we've kind of broken our episode today down into 2 parts. So we are going to start off by talking about what the difference between a 504 and an IEP is, just to give some general background knowledge, because I think that's one that also parents have a lot of questions about, like what's the difference between the two? And then we'll talk about, okay, your child has a 504 or an IEP, so what does that mean or look like if you decide to homeschool? So if you've ever wondered how homeschooling works for a child who has accommodation, therapies, learning challenges, or is coming to homeschooling after having an IEP or a 504 within a district, you're definitely not alone, and that's what today's episode is really all about.
Yeah. And it definitely, there's a lot to cover with this, and so we're going to do our best to try to give you information, but not like overload you with information. Right. It also, what we're telling you is the general guidelines for it. Different states, districts, schools handle this type of setup differently, depending on even if you're at a private school versus public, it's different what it looks like.
Right.
So we're going to give you as much as we can without overloading you. And even if you're not a homeschooling parent, but you are a parent of a kid in school, you might find this episode interesting because you might, maybe your kid has a 504 or IEP, or that's been brought up to you. You don't know what the difference is and all that stuff. So, so I was going to start off by giving you a brief explanation of what a 504 plan is. So a 504 plan is all about access. So it gives a student accommodation so that they can learn in the same environment as their peers. So a child might get a 504 plan if they had like a medical, physical, or mental condition that interferes with their ability to fully participate in school or access the curriculum the same as their peers. So the goal of 504 is equal access, but not special instructions, so to speak. So like it would provide things like extra time, or like a quiet testing area, breaks if needed, things like that. Minor classroom adjustments, like it might be something where, like if you had a child with vision issues and they needed to be closer to the board, that would be something that would be on a 504 plan. Or if they had vision issues and they required whatever, like notes that the teacher put on the board, they required them to be on a tablet in front of them or something like that, so that they had, equal access, but it's the same information. It's just they needed different ways to access that information. So, or medical or physical support. So this does not include, 504s don't include specialized instruction or specific academic goals. That's not written in a 504 plan, or direct services like speech, OT. That is not part of what a 504 plan is. So the best way I like to explain is to give like an example, because I do think that helps me learn. So, so I was thinking of, for example, a student with ADHD. So they might require something like extra time on a test, a quiet spot for completing assessments. Again, they're still doing the same assessment. It's just they need to be in a quiet environment to take that assessment. Breaks between subjects, still doing the subject, but they need a break between it. Or might have extra use of a planner or a checklist type of organizer to help keep them on track, things like that. It's not changing the material. They're still learning the same lessons. It just gives them a better chance to be successful because of some accommodations that they have. So I always like to think of it as a child can learn the same material but needs support to access it. And so like this would be something that I would have looked at with my children, because they both have severe vision issues. So they would definitely have a 504 plan if they were in a public school. Private schools don't necessarily call it a 504 plan. There might be specific accommodations for the child that's based off of the family working with the teachers and things. But if you're in the private school sector, it's a whole different ball game, which that would be like an entirely other episode because it doesn't correlate. And if you want to do formalized plans like a 504 IEP and you're in a private school, there's a whole different channel of things you need to go through to do that. So that would be another episode.
Right. Yeah,
so if for nothing else, so again, the 504 It's your child's doing the same thing, same material. They're doing the same material, no special instruction. It's just to access that material, they need different support. So with my guys with their vision, they would probably have a 504 and have certain things on there like have access to large print books. So still reading the same book, but their book would be large print. They would be, sat at the front of the classroom. So they would be the closest to the board to have access to be able to see what the teacher's writing. They might even require special notes on their desk that are what the teacher's putting on the board, that kind of thing. They're not receiving a different curriculum or different instruction. It's the same. It's just they need support to access it the same way another child does in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So that was breaking down a 504. Hopefully not too complicated. That was my goal. So hopefully that makes sense to you.
Right.
And then now Kelly has to do the same for an IEP.
Yes. And I will say too, 504 too, like sometimes you'll see them be a little more temporary than an IEP as far as like, a kiddo who maybe like they break their leg, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're in a wheelchair or something. And so they require, like they have to leave class early, right? Because they have to make it to their next class. And some of the stuff too, it's like, okay, do they need a 504 or is it just something, these accommodations we can kind of make for the learner, as they go. So, and also looking specifically at whatever, the diagnosis might be. So it really is like a lesser, sometimes you'll see kids, which I'll talk about in a second, an IEP, but you'll see like a kid on an IEP and then they'll transition to a 504 rather than just like not having anything. But I had thrown out the idea of a 504 when Owen was in preschool, when they told me that he was a lot. And I like went and sort of had like an OT evaluation done, but then I sat down and I was like, okay, like, let's talk about this. Does he need a 504? He didn't really even have a diagnosis at that time. So it was sort of like, okay, do I need to now like go and get a diagnosis for him to be able to access? And eventually the district just sort of walked it back. And, after he had settled in, they're like, oh no, he's great. It's fine. But just kind of arming yourself with that kind of information. If you're finding that, your learner does maybe have some sort of diagnosis or disability or something like that, that this is an option and to use. And then the other thing too, just really quickly, is each school usually has a 504 coordinator that is different than your special ed coordinator. In the schools that I've been, it's usually the vice principal, but I'm sure that could probably change.
Yeah. And again, if you're at a private school, it won't be this.
I don't know anything about private schools.
This language and terminology will not be used the same. Private schools are often much more willing to make accommodations without formal assessments. But if you were to actually want, like from a public school, a 504 or an IEP plan, you are looking at needing to get an actual diagnosis of something for obviously, if you're broken leg, the doctor is telling you you have to, not use your leg. So that's gonna apply. But even if it was some sort of like an anxiety disorder where, I had a student once who had, she had a real aversion to loud sounds and had noise canceling headphones. And she, certain accommodations had to be made for her in the hallways and the lunchrooms, and even being notified about when there was, fire drills even leaving, assemblies at certain times because of the noise aversion. That was something that only lasted a couple of years, right? And then she kind of phased out of it because she ended up receiving support for that she didn't have to use the headphones anymore. So that only followed her for a few years. But again, that had to get to the point. If she had been at a public school, she would have had to have a diagnosis done to get an official 504. Being in private, it's up to, it's very different depending on the private school and how they work with that kind of a thing. It's just different.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
all right. So then jumping into an IEP. So an IEP, it stands for an individualized education program. So it's about specialized instruction, and it is a legal document underneath the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's a lot more in-depth than a 504 plan. So we're talking about like multiple pages, lots of different parts of the IEP, very specific. So a child would get an IEP if they have a disability that impacts their ability to make progress in school. And that's the biggest part of an IEP. You have to sort of show through assessments and all that kind of stuff that your disability is impacting your ability to learn and access the general education curriculum as typically developing peers. So there's lots of different categories of disabilities that are that a child could get an IEP under. Won't go into like a lot of information about each one, but just like really quickly. So a specific learning disability. So they have a dyslexia or dyscalculia or dysgraphia. I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
So they need that specialized instruction that we had talked about a while ago with like the difference between like, oh, is it dyslexia or is it just, difficulty with reading, right? So a difficulty in reading wouldn't qualify you for an IEP, right? You need to have a diagnosis of dyslexia in order to qualify under specific learning disability. Speech and language impairments, although this only goes up until I think it's age 7. After age 7, you can no longer qualify for an IEP under speech and language impairment. You have to qualify underneath something else. The law may have changed since then, so like please do your own research and like double check my facts. But as far the last information that I knew was that up until about the age 7, you could no longer have just a speech only IEP. And then autism spectrum disorder. So, that's a whole nother episode, but like, deficits in social interaction, communication, maladaptive behaviors, lots of different things going on there. Again, that requires a diagnosis if it's done by a neuropsych, it's an evaluation, it's a whole big thing. Intellectual disability. So this would be something that, you would need to score below a certain amount on an intelligence test. You have below average cognitive functioning that impacts your learning. Emotional or behavioral disorders, or sometimes things like anxiety or ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. So that would sort of be right in my wheelhouse, right? You need like a behavior plan or something like that. And then other health impairment could be like chronic health issues. ADHD falls underneath that one as other health impaired. So lots of different categories, but again, the key thing is that you really need a diagnosis, right? You can't just say like, oh, my kid needs, better reading, needs reading help. Don't mind my dog. So
can I just throw in there? So what I would just add into that too is this is where I think it gets tricky for people because they'll be like, oh, well, I thought ADHD fell under like a 504 plan, not an IEP. So I think it can, yes. People can have both 504 and IEP plans. And it's all about, right, the individual learner and how that issue is presenting itself, whether they need just support and access to the instruction, or they actually need they need different instruction. And so that's where, the 504 plan is just about access, whereas the IEP is much more involved, and it's, they have goals that they're setting, and it's more, they need specific changes to their instruction. But it can be behavioral as well. It can be both. Right. So that's where I think people's
right. And I think Anna explained it really well. Like the 504 plan is just accommodations. Right. Like here are the things that you need to access the general education curriculum, and you're making progress in the general education curriculum as long as you have access to these accommodations.
Right. Yeah.
Your IEP is going to be you're not making progress in the general education curriculum. You need more now explicit specialized instruction. Yeah. By a special education teacher or other, providers to then make progress to then, be able to catch up to your typically developing peers. And then also you will need accommodations to be able to do that. So
it's both.
Yeah, it's both. So an IEP sort of encompasses your goals, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but like also your accommodations. So I don't know how likely it is that you would have both an IEP and a 504, because an IEP sort of has like a 504 in it. But you don't need both of those. If you have an IEP.
Swallows.
And if you have a 504, then clearly you don't need an IEP. But anyway, so the other thing too that I forgot to say is that under this law of IDEA or IDEA is that parents and then the student are entitled to free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And so this is also a part of the document that you'll see, like where, the learner will spend their instructional time, and you have to check off where they will be. And so some learners, if you're talking about, an individual that has, severe intellectual disabilities, your general education classroom is not is not the least restrictive environment for them. So they maybe need to be in a smaller classroom. They maybe need to be in a classroom that only has a few students. They maybe need to be in an out of district placement, right? Where there's, a full-time nurse assigned to the classroom. So it really depends on the profile of the learner, and that's the point, right? That it's individualized, but just keeping that in mind, right? That like least restrictive environment means like the environment that this learner can make the most progress in without it being overly restrictive. So if I'm thinking about a kid with ADHD, that classroom for those individuals that have severe cognitive deficits, that's not the least restrictive environment for your kid with ADHD, right? Like that doesn't match where they're at. So just being really thoughtful about that. And this is where sometimes I think as far as out of district placements or like specialized classrooms, this is where parents and teachers or parents and schools sometimes have the battles, right? Like the school is saying like, no, they're okay. We can provide all these supports. We can provide all this specialized instruction within the general education classroom. And the parents are saying like, no, it's not working, like, or, vice versa. Like the school is saying, no, they need a more restrictive placement. And we have these specialized classrooms and the teachers or the parents are saying like, no, I think if you would just do the things that you're supposed to do and give the support that you need in the general education classroom, this would be,
the beef starts.
Exactly.
And that happens, I would say, as well in private school. It's a lot easier to accommodate a 504 because again, it's accommodations to it. Right. Even if it's not an official plan, you can kind of like, we've kind of come up with this together. We've worked with the families and this is going to work for us. If it gets to the point where a private school is recommending that a child get like a neuropsych evaluation or there's something done, they might be, depending on the level of where your child is, if your child has autism and they need to be, counseled out of that private school because they just do not have the services in-house for that.
Right.
That's when a private school, it cannot be the best fit for your child because they don't always have, oftentimes, they're not the school for a child with, severe autism or other disabilities. They don't have it. And even when it comes to other learning, if it's a really small private school, they may not have a reading specialist on staff. And if you've got a child who has dyslexia and they need that, they may be looking at having to receive support elsewhere or finding a different school. So that's, it can be a challenge at times if you're at a private school and you're needing a lot of IEP type of resources because the school may or may not have it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so within an IEP, there's lots of different like components. You have the individualized goals. So that's the first thing. Usually you'll also do like a page where it'll say like present levels of academic performance, and then you'll talk about like their strengths, and then you'll talk about your needs. And your needs should realistically then be matched to a goal. Because if you're saying that a child has a need and has an area of difficulty, then there should be a goal attached to that, right? Like, oh, they need to be reading at grade level. Okay, well, right now, what are they doing? Oh, they're reading at, a first grade level and they're in fifth grade. Okay, so we need to write a goal for that. How are we going to get this kid who's reading at a first grade level because of their, disability, to a fifth grade reading level? And you do that with a very, specialized goal that then has different, components and things like that. So then you also get into your specialized instruction, which would probably be somewhere in the goal. And then any related services, so like speech, OT, PT, any sort of like counseling services. Some districts, not in Rhode Island, but in like Connecticut and Massachusetts, they might write applied behavior analysis, ABA services into an IEP. They might have to do, an hour of ABA therapy built into their day. The progress monitoring basically just talks about like how often, which this always drives me nuts, how often progress will be reported to parents. And then you also have a team. Now you have a 504 usually is like the parents, usually sometimes the learner, depending on how old they are and what their level is.
It's not as,
and then the 504 coordinator. So when you have, your IEP team, you have the parent, you have your, your representative, I get their name, the LEA, which I don't know what that stands for right off the top of my head. You have your LEA who kind of runs the meeting. You usually have the school psychologist. You have the special education teacher. You have the regular education teacher. You might have speech. You might have PT. You might have OT. Like, there is a huge range of people that are sitting, whoever, like if the parents bring an advocate, like I go to IEP meetings, I'll sit with the family and just kind of listen and chat and talk about what we're doing, you know, in the home or in the clinic. So there's a huge team of people there. And I think the other thing that sometimes can be tricky with parents in an IEP, right? And why some parents, I think, decide to homeschool a child with an IEP is because they feel like decisions are being made in spite of what the parent is advocating for, right? Because it has to be a team decision, right? And the team has to agree. And sometimes I think parents feel bullied into agreeing to something that maybe it's not exactly what they want, right? Because you have this huge group of people and everybody's telling you, this, that, oh, that'll definitely, oh, we can do that. No, that'll be handled with this, or that's not a concern. We don't see that here. So you can feel a little, bullied. And it's hard in a room of people who you feel like are professionals. I know if it were me and I was walking into a room full of doctors and they were all telling me like, hey, you have to do that, I'd probably be like, okay, yeah, let's do it. It can be really, really hard being a parent and walking into this IEP meeting and feeling like, no, I know my child best and I'm not going to back down. But then they make the decision sort of without you. And I should know this because I was a special education major and things like that. But I don't know that if the district has demonstrated like good faith, that they've really tried to accommodate the parent, and they've tried, even like sometimes in Fall River, we'd have like good faith, like, okay, we've tried to meet like 7 times and the parents just aren't showing up. You implement the new IEP so that you're in compliance. And so like if a parent is basically saying like, I don't agree with this document and like there's arbitration coming or whatever, they're just like flat out refusing, the district can go ahead and implement the IEP without the parent's consent. So that's the other part that gets really tricky. It's like, okay, if you lose some of the autonomy, I think, as a parent, and I don't want to like keep going, I know that's not really what this is about, but it can feel very, it can feel very hard. And I empathize with a lot of people that have sat in those meetings and felt bullied and felt like they weren't being heard on their child's behalf. And I think that's why also sometimes parents decide to homeschool, right? Because they feel like they're not being heard, their child's needs aren't being met. And that the district is just plowing on, and you haven't really fully considered everything that I'm telling you, or you feel like they're gaslighting you a little bit of just like, oh, it's not an issue, we don't see that here.
I mean, I haven't sat in on anywhere near as many IEP meetings as you have, but the ones that I have sat in on, I would say that there were times that I remember pausing and just asking the parent if they were okay, because I was very aware, and this is true, that the schools are, I'm overworked, sometimes stressed. They're doing a ton of these a day. They kind of want to know what's best. It's sort of like a doctor that has bad bedside manner. It's like, just listen to me. I've done this. I know what they need, blah, 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 blah. And they can lose sight of the fact that this is a vulnerable parent there who this is not every day, that they're doing this, or they don't know what the outcome might be. Like, you might think that this is best, but they don't always know. And I've seen them be shot down. And I've also sometimes felt like I've been in like a legal briefing. It's like they're using, because there are a lot of education terminology, jargon that can be thrown out. And it's sort of like, my dad, who was a lawyer, I can remember like at times looking through, I don't know, something he'd have or whatever. I'm like, I can't read any of this. And he's like, yeah, it's like legalese or whatever. It's like written in the legal terms, and it's not what the average everyday person knows, because that's not what they've studied. And so I can remember terms being thrown out and the parents being like, okay, but they don't know what any of these things mean. And, so hopefully if you're in an IEP meeting and you have someone in there, that's why sometimes advocates are brought in for the parents who can who do know what is being said and can sort of pause and try to make sure the parent's being heard. And some IEP meetings are great. And I have been where people have been very sensitive and supportive and really wanting to hear, but there's definitely the other side of the coin where it can be incredibly overwhelming for a parent. And they leave without either having their voice heard at all, or being very unhappy with what the plan is, but there really isn't that much control over what the plan's going to be.
Right. Yeah. So it's true.
It's tricky.
And then the other thing too, I kind of talked about this a little bit, is an IEP will provide the accommodations that someone would get with a 504, which, is important. Things like extra time or, less amount of text on the page or whatever. And then it also provides modifications. So when we're talking about modifications, we're talking about actually changing the curriculum and what they're learning.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. So a 504 plan is not going to have modifications, whereas an IEP can have those modifications on it. So we can think of an IEP, and there's so much more too. And if people have like more general questions or specific questions about like IEP and what this is or what this means or whatever, please feel free to reach out. And I'll do the best that we can to kind of answer some general, maybe a little bit specific questions without getting too much in the weeds. But we can think of an IEP as the child needs, specialized teaching or access to specialized therapies like your OT or your speech and language, to learn and make progress. And in some cases that also might mean different curriculum. And districts try really, really hard to hold kids that are on IEPs to the same grade level standards. But it does get to a point, especially if you're looking at learners with like significant cognitive or intellectual disabilities, where the general education curriculum just does not make sense, right? Like, they're not doing calculus, right? They're not doing algebra. We need them to be able to maybe just like add money and use that in a functional way, because this is the plan for this person as they, get towards adulthood. And then there's a whole big piece too, as kids get older and they do get into like middle school, high school, that they start talking about like transition planning and what is that going to look like? What's the plan? An IEP can also carry a learner up until age 21. So, if you have someone who has, again, like significant, like, physical or mental or whatever it might be, a disability, they might be in school till they're 21. And then after 21, that's when they're no longer covered under an IEP. So, an example really quickly for, someone who would have an IEP would be, a fourth grader with dyslexia. So they would get their daily one-to-one structured reading instruction in like an Orton Gillingham or a Wilson reading program.
They're getting it totally different than the average.
Extra time on reading and writing assignments. So that would be an accommodation, right? Audiobooks and text-to-speech support, right? Depending on what the audiobook is, depending on what the text-to-speech and the expectation are, that could be an accommodation or a modification. And then their progress being tracked monthly. And then I would also add, obviously, like they would have some sort of goal tied to that daily one-to-one specialized reading instruction. So by this date, they should be able to do this. By this date, they should be able to do that. Because, right, you need to have some accountability tied to this specialized instruction. It's not just like, all right, you get specialized instruction and then that's it. Like you've got to, have the data to sort of back it up. So again, significantly more than just accommodations, really about teaching the child in a way that meets their unique learning needs. Kids can have an IEP, and then, like I said, they can transition to a 504. So, you'll do your initial meeting where you'll qualify for special education. Then you'll do several other meetings that are just annual reviews. So every year they'll come together, they'll rewrite the IEP with the team will get together. And then every 3 years, you'll do a reevaluation where all of those assessments that were done to make the initial determination will be done again to see if they still qualify. So a little bit different than a 504 as far as like holding the team accountable to like once you have an IEP, we don't keep them on an IEP forever, right? Like we have to make sure that this is still something that is happening, or we can then move them to a 504. So lots of information out there about IEPs. There's also, like Anna said, a lot of like technical jargon that goes along with it. So I don't have any like recommendations as far as like books or anything to like read as a parent with a child with with an IEP, but I'm sure there are some out there that can kind of like really break it down for you as far as like what does progress monitoring mean?
Like,
like what is
But the good news is that, if you want to homeschool and your child has 504 or IEP, you can.
Yes.
It's not, it's not like, oh, they have to be in school in order to be.
Although the district may, if you say, they are very much going to push back on you.
Yeah.
Because, and I can say this, I think, because I've been a teacher, like, school districts have egos. They definitely have egos, and they definitely feel like they know best and they have the best resources to provide the services that kids need, and they trump you in their ability to educate your child. So just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind, that I don't know how many districts would be very supportive of a person who, just says, like, or asks, like, I'm thinking, do you think homeschool would be a better option? I'm going to tell you that probably a large percentage of them are going to say no. You can't do what we do, kind of thing.
And depending on what the child has the IEP for, you need to be realistic about what you'll have to do as a homeschooling parent in order to meet those needs as well. So, because there's severity, we gave that kind of example, which was a pretty straightforward, a fourth grader who has dyslexia. Okay, it's a pretty, run-of-the-mill example, but it can get very involved in
you're working on, someone who has, like, severe cognitive impairments plus medical needs, on like a feeding tube plus, very low functioning as far as like IQ, then, a highly specialized placement may be the best, spot for them, unless you're really, tied to, okay, no, I can do this and this is what it's going to look like and all that kind of stuff. So.
I would say, generally speaking, for 504, if they have a 504 and you plan to homeschool, most of what those accommodations are pretty easy to do at home, which is a bright side. So just kind of knock that one off. Of an IEP, we can get more specific, but a lot of accommodations that are made for 504 plans have to do with like I had given some before about like seating or time on things or breaks or things like that. All very useful and important, but obviously things you can do at home. You can emulate those things at home. For me, with my learners, like with the vision, if anything, I think it's better to be at home because they, we can, the way I can make things big for them, and other things like that. So, a lot of those, I don't think we would find very tricky. I'm just trying to run through a lot of the recommendations I've seen on 504s. I don't think that there would be many that you couldn't sort of work out yourself at home and work into your routine is how well that learner needs to learn. IEPs would be a little bit different, but we did say, so that now you've decided to homeschool. So now what? So this is if you're pulling your kid right out of a homeschool, they've been in school, they have a 504 and IEP. This is not necessarily like you've been homeschooling from day one. You think your child needs a 504 and IEP or something like that because you want access to specialized instruction. That's a different type of problem we'd have to run down. Yeah. But if you're in the situation where you want to homeschooling, take your kid out, and they have in place a 504 and IEP plan, what you would need to do is find out legally what your rights are, right? And at this point, was it that we found out that if you take your child out, they are not like that 504 and IEP is no longer, it doesn't actually apply.
It really depends on what state you live in. Like I tried to go down the rabbit hole and I just don't understand why it can't just be like very clear cut.
I know.
So no, there's like, it depends. So for our state, in the state of Rhode Island, once you withdraw your child from public school, the IEP mostly plan no longer applies, right? And so you now have forfeited your right to those services. So if you have a learner that's been receiving speech services 3 times a week for 30 minutes a day in school, you can't say, I'm going to homeschool, but I'll bring them in at 10:30 every, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for speech. Because the district's going to say, no. So, you just know that you are sort of waiving your right to. And sometimes in the guidance that I've given some of my people that I work with, as far as their learners coming out and doing full day ABA as opposed to being in school, I have said specifically to the parents, just make sure that you write that you are aware that you are waiving your right to all of this related services per the IEP. And also making sure that, I wouldn't know just know that you don't have access to those services.
Yeah. And some states, it's different. Some have special education homeschool programs or funding for private therapies, but again, it's very state-based. So if you're wherever you are, you're wanting to pull your kid out, find out at your state level, or even go to your district, or find out what it is that you might still have access to, if maybe anything. But most likely it's going to be
probably bare minimum. Yeah.
But you have your 504 plan or your IEP in place, so those can still be something that you can lean on or use as sort of your roadmap for planning out what you want to get in place yourself now that you're going to be homeschooling your child. So, right, if you had that 504 and you saw that, they had frequent breaks, or they had, I don't know, they were
less problems on the page.
You can obviously do that yourself. With an IEP, you might be looking at, do I need to now find a reading specialist if they were receiving that kind of support, or get them hooked up with whatever,
a tutor,
whatever kind of support you needed to do. And so you're looking at, use it as a blueprint to sort of structure your day. Can the accommodations be done at home, or the specialized instruction, therapy goals? Are you going to continue to do that yourself? Progress, use that as your kind of blueprint for how you want to go forward at home.
And as far as those services too, as far as speech and language and occupational therapy, physical therapy, even ABA, so you can access those services through outside providers. The school district does not own all of the speech language pathologists that are out there. No, there are private SLPs and private OTs and things like that. And I think we'll get to it a little bit later, but just check with your insurance company and just figure out what's covered and what's not. And then you can go from there as far as still getting them. So, you're waiving your right to the services provided by the school district, but a lot of times parents will also, if they're getting in school speech, they'll also have an outside speech provider as well, or as an outside OT provider. Or maybe the parent feels no, we really actually do still need OT, and the district's no, actually, he met all of his OT goals, we don't see a need. The team has decided, then the parent might seek outside OT.
So if you're thinking about choosing curriculum or approach, there are I would say a lot of very structured curriculums have built in, you want to look for programs. So if you have a child with an IEP, most of this will apply for if it's an IEP, not a 504. But a lot of, like Kelly emphasized a lot, the importance of progress monitoring, tracking your child. I would say you want to continue to do that a lot, because there is a difficulty, or there is a need to be watching that a little bit closer than, somebody who doesn't have that. So a lot of very structured curriculums often have a tracking, progress built into them. So that might be one that you would be more likely to go with, because it's already sort of part of how they're doing it. But whether there's online programs, virtual classes that would fit your learner better, project-based things, or interest-led, learning, again, depending on what the issue is with your child, or the support you need, and getting those therapies in place would be really important.
And then I think kind of, again, using the accommodations to sort of build your day, right? If you have a learner that has, ADHD, or just anxiety or something like that, creating a schedule that it has all those accommodations already, okay, we're going to do this, for 15 minutes, and then we're going to do a brain break, or we're going to take a walk, or then we're just going to take a break and we're just going to do something else. Movement breaks or sensory breaks, or okay, now we've got to get in the car and we got to go to, our speech therapy, and then we'll come home and we'll do this, or we're going to do this thing first, and then we're going to go play, and then we're going to come back to the table, and then we'll do this. And just kind of really using, again, like Anna said, the document as a roadmap. These are the accommodations that the team decided would help make my learner successful. How can I kind of create a schedule that just has all of those accommodations just built in? Which I think as a homeschooler you naturally do, right? You're not expecting them to sit for 45 minutes, and attend to a lesson, and then do this, and then transition here and transition there. And sometimes accommodations will be verbal reminders to that transition is coming. Okay, well, I don't really know what parent doesn't do that, right? Hey, in 10 minutes, we're going to go. Or in 10 minutes, I'm going to ask you to clean up your toys, or whatever it may be, or we're going to go to the table. So those are easy enough to be able to do, but just kind of using them to build a really flexible homeschooling day.
Yeah.
And again, like I had said in a previous episode, your learner really knows best. So just kind of just taking that into account when you're building your day.
Yeah. Keeping a very probably thorough log of, progress, tracking improvements, even things like math skills, fluency, whatever it might be, and document that would really be helpful for many reasons. One being, if you ever did decide to return to public school, that would be really important to have on record. But these sort of updates and this progress tracking is just even more important for a child who's has an IEP or learning process, because it's not kind of like, right, you can't just assume that the progression is going to happen the way it might with a learner without an IEP, because you have to be more on top of it, so to speak, I guess. And so just be really thoughtful about the tracking that you're doing of what services they're receiving and how that's going, and then getting support. That I actually noted, I didn't know this, but I have a friend who has a friend who has a son who's autistic, and there are actually some homeschooling groups in this state that we're in that have like meetups for kids with certain disabilities or challenges or whatever, and that it's a really great place also for parents to sort of swap, like, oh, I was using this curriculum, they couldn't stand, we tried this, or I know sometimes the tips that they get from other families that are doing it too. And so you might be surprised that there's actually a network out there of homeschooling families that might have kids with a similar profile or makeup, or going through, having had an IEP, and how we're making that work at home. And, it's not like it hasn't been done before. It has. So, online support groups, tutors, therapists that give you input onto, what they're seeing with your child.
Yeah, just access like as many supports as you can would probably be my biggest thing. And then also, and so many families are really great at this anyway, but just knowing that like you are your child's best advocate, and you know your child, and you obviously, if you start to homeschool, you'll know they're learning, and so accessing the supports and getting help, but also being a strong advocate for like, well, I don't actually think that this is working or helping, or this thing that you gave me to work on is just, it's not going well, we might need to do this instead. So just not being afraid to have a voice. And I feel like, not to harp on it too much, but like I do feel like sometimes in those IEP meetings, the parents their voice is sort of taken from them. And again, I feel like I can kind of say that because I've been a special education teacher, and I've sat in some of these meetings, and and everyone is lovely, and for the most part, and everyone will tell like a funny anecdote, or no one sits there and it's just like, oh, this kid's such a pain. No, they all have like nice things to say, but it's just the undercurrent, I think, that's there sometimes. So just kind of keeping that in mind as well.
And that's the difference between it's because I do think sometimes that people don't give teachers and all of them like the respect sometimes they deserve for their expertise, but at the same time, this is not like a lawyer who you're trusting because they're bringing you're going to court and they're representing you on this case, and and it's really like, yes, it has to do with you because you're the one who's I don't know, on trial for whatever. But that lawyer is the one who knows how this all works, and your who you are as a person doesn't totally factor into the case that they are now presenting to the court. Whereas, and even that, I would imagine that they would want some input from you. But when it comes to this is about like your child and your what you know about them, and what you see as a parent is so unbelievably important, and educators should be listening to that, even though it can be even though you should be listening to educators sometimes, as far as if they're really recommending this and you want to learn more about it, but you are also, it is a team, like you said, right? You wouldn't think of it as like, right, if you go to a lawyer to represent you, and you're not thinking that you're working with the lawyer. Normally the lawyer's like they're kind of
doctor, even like they have recommendations, like you need to make sure you do this after your surgery so that this doesn't happen. But like you're not beside them in the the decision about what surgery should be done. You don't have that same,
it's not the same thing.
So I mean, I think
so. Like feel for like so it's like you want to give, so like teachers, it's like a catch-22. It's like they have a professional wisdom and you know, guidance that they absolutely should be, you know, in sharing with you as the parent, but it's different in that this is your child that you also know really well. It's not like you're another fellow surgeon who can be, like, weigh in on it and be like, oh, well, I've done these surgeries too, so I think like, you're both weighing in on a child that you both know. The teachers know it and you know it, and so it really, if it's not working or feeling like a team, then there is something wrong, and there needs to be a real mutual respect and understanding for the other person. And I do think at times the parent doesn't get that, because the teachers are just like, we're the professionals, we know it all, like yes, you are the professional and you should be imparting your piece of it, but the parent is the parent.
Almost like in an IEP meeting. Sometimes I do feel like there is a little bit of this, like, I mean, I don't know if mom mentality is the right way, but just like, we're all in this together, and we all, like, because I mean, I'll be honest with you, like, there are times before the parent walks in that team is sitting and saying, like, okay, so what is it that we're doing here? Like, what are we trying to get? And I mean, in some I've sat in that they've been like, okay, what are we trying to get the parent to agree to here? Like, what is it? Because that's just the mentality that they have. And I'm certainly not guiltless in it. I've done it and been like, I think I know exactly what it is that this child needs, and you know, the supports and stuff like that, and they need to continue to maybe be in this more restrictive placement, or I do think, like I said, I do think there are some egos, and I think when you get a bunch of people together that all have the same sort of knowledge base and wisdom, and then there's one that doesn't, they kind of all just the dynamic can be really weird.
Right. It's also unfortunate that normally, like you said, it is such a big team, because I've sat at the table where it's been like 9 educators and then the one parent sitting there, and you're just like, okay, this feels really uneven, and I almost wish that there like wasn't as much representation from everyone under the sun, because I do think that can be overwhelming as well. So it's, you know, it's not a perfect process. I mean, that's just, it's not. It's not.
And please understand, you know, I'm not sitting here and saying that, like, you know, special education teachers are doing, you know, parents dirty or anything like that. I do believe that a lot of them have their best interest in heart. I just think that schools are also coming in, and not to like go on this big long diatribe, but the schools are also coming in with like, okay, what can we like reasonably provide? You know what I mean? We cannot like, I remember I took in my first master's class, which I didn't end up continuing at PC, but I started at PC, and one of the classes that we took was a 504. So I should be much more well-versed in 504s, but this was like 10, maybe even 12 years ago at this point. But anyway, so it was like, you know, we had to create a 504 plan for this person. We were given a person, and they said, like, create a 504 plan for this and like run a 504 meeting, pretend. I mean, we like gave this kid, I mean, everything under the sun, right? School had a swimming pool. They did this therapy, they did that therapy, completely unrealistic, right? So like, the school can only do so much, right? Like there's typically, you know, very few special education teachers. You know, they have to prioritize the kids that are the neediest, that are the highest need. And so, you know, when you're sitting there and you're saying like, well, they need more specialized instruction, they need more time with this, the team is going to sit there and be like, the document should be written as if, yes, every single thing that they need. But again, there is this other piece of like, well, we can't put that in this document because we're legally bound to this. And if we're not doing it, we're going to be found out of compliance, and there's going to be a lawsuit. And so like, we're going to say that they don't need that much time because we can't provide that much time. Right. No,
it's making me laugh because I just know, because when I taught nurseries, you're talking 3-year-olds. I mean, these are little. And I remember having a student who had, it would have been in the public, even though they're so little, and those things shouldn't be written for anybody, I don't think, until they're kindergarten age. But they had what would essentially be is kind of like a 504 plan, but working with their OT person and things that this child needed to be successful in the classroom, having had some issues and challenges. And the list of things, and the parents were completely, it wasn't until I pointed out, and I think I did it in a pretty, you know, tactful way. Not possible. I mean, I think one of them was something about, you know, because it was really one of the, you know, pushing and exerting pressure on things. So like one of the ideas was, you know, like randomly throughout the day, the child would have 4 opportunities to push the tables from one side of the room to the other. And I'm just sort of like, and what what are the rest of my nursery kids going to do while he just gets up and pushes the table from one side of the room to the other? I'm like, what? And that was like one of them. And then the other one was like, there was this great playground right outside of where, we were, but that child was to, before we did any certain X, Y, and Z, they got to go out and run and do some laps or something of it. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't have a TA. So who's thinking am I leaving one-to-one? Right. Am I either leaving all my nursery kids, or am I not? How is that? But it was, and the parents were actually really understanding once I kind of pointed out some of these things, because they came in thinking that all these things were possible. And I was just like, okay, but look at this in this. And they actually were really great. They very quickly were like, oh yeah, oh wait, none of this probably wouldn't work. And I'm like, right. Or like during rest time, you need to be in a completely black space with no, I'm like, okay, this is a nursery class. They're not going to be, I can't make that happen. So this is like, well, if you want these accommodations, you homeschool. I mean, because those are the ones where it's like you can make all that happen if you want, if you homeschool. But sometimes too, it was like, I don't think parents, they see it like, oh great, implement it, not thinking like, oh wait a minute, you're like in a class of however many. So
it definitely is.
It's the best case scenario is when both listen to each other. The parents listen to the educators, and they listen to the parents. But there can be, I think I've seen more often than not, unfortunately, educators coming in with, this is our agenda, this is what we can do, sign off on it or not, but that's kind of the plan. And I think that does lead some parents to think like, okay, I'm not being listened to, and they might have very valid ideas about things that could work for their kid, and they're not. I ran into that a little bit. My older son wasn't in school long enough, but I could see this coming up, certain things that wanted, it wasn't with his vision, it was more with his selective mutism, things that they wanted to implement or goals they wanted to set. And I felt like it was pushing too much, too fast. And I was like, he's still not even comfortable in the classroom yet. Like, so to be pushing some of these like speech goals with him, I was, and again, the school that I was working at, it was a private school. So I didn't have to have documentation the way I would have in a public school, but I was already feeling some of that, like, they were coming at, and and I'm an educator, and it was a school I was at. These were my colleagues. It wasn't, and I don't want to be like they were really awful or anything. They weren't. They were great in a lot of ways. But I could already sense that in some of our meetings, like that there was going to be. I was worried that down the line, my that voice, and I'm thinking, man, if my voice is going to be not heard at a school that I teach at, and I'm a professional in this field, I can't imagine how a parent who comes in off, the cuff, how they would feel sitting in on something like this. So it's a lot, but the bottom line is that many people homeschool. If you try to think about it, that you're not necessarily losing the unique learning support, just because they're home, you take on a new personalized shape under your guidance. They're getting support, but in a different way, and you're in charge of it. You're able to use what it is that you weren't able to get across maybe in your IEP meeting or your 504 meeting. And I think that's really important. So finding out what your state guidelines are for that, like we had said before, because clearly it does changes depending on what state you're in. But know that like all the services that your child's receiving in school are available outside in the community. It's just having to find it, piece together that for yourself. But it could be well worth it for you. And I know a lot of families who have homeschooled, taking their kids out, who have found it to be a very rewarding experience, and that they really appreciate being more hands-on and knowing what their child's receiving and how their child's progressing. It's helped their relationship. It's helped, I think they think it's helped their child a lot more, versus kind of just trusting the school to be like, okay, let's hope that they're getting everything and it's all working the way it's supposed to, because it's a big leap of faith. Sometimes.
It definitely is. So if anybody, like I said, has any like general or sort of maybe specific questions, you can definitely ask them on our social media or drop them here or whatever. We're happy to give some additional guidance without, disclosing too much. But just, feel a little bit empowered. If you're thinking about, can I do this? My child has an IEP. How does this work? Should I do it? Kind of thing. We do really hope that this episode has, shed some light on that it is possible, and with some, just a little bit of effort, and really kind of being aware of some of the things that we talked about, you can definitely have some success homeschooling a child that comes with an IEP. And I think, as Anna said, it seems daunting at first, but I think once you get in it and you get into a routine and figure out what it is that your child needs to be successful, it can definitely be very beneficial for both them and for you. So
Right. Doesn't
Yeah.
have to just be services they're receiving in the school. You can,
Right,
you
right.
can figure,
Yeah.
you can get those services yourself and,
Yes.
have a little faith in your abilities and what you can put in place for your child, because usually if you're going to pull them out, there's something that's making you pull them out.
Mhm.
And, I don't know if it'd be worth, your peace of mind setting them somewhere that you're not loving or not comfortable with just because they're receiving the service they're
Yeah.
supposed to get, that
Yeah.
it shouldn't feel that way. If you're unhappy or, there are other options. So
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for listening to our episode today. And Kelly mentioned if you've got more specific questions, but hopefully you left here having a better sense of what a 504 is, what an IEP is, and some confidence in homeschooling with one of those for if your child has one. So,
Yeah.
All right. So until next time, keep the moments light and the lessons meaningful.
Thanks for escaping with us.